The story of the Challenger 2 main battle tank begins not with a triumph of engineering foresight, but with a humiliating realization within the corridors of the Ministry of Defense during the late 1980s. The British Army, the institution that had invented the armored Leviathan during the First World War, was facing the very real prospect of watching its domestic heavy armor industry collapse entirely. The armored regiments of the British Army of the Rhine were deployed across West Germany, waiting for a Soviet onslaught that was expected to feature thousands of heavily armored T-72 and T-80 main battle tanks pouring across the inner German border. To counter this existential threat, the British were relying on the Chieftain, a tank with an excellent gun, but an infamous multi-fuel engine that was so mechanically unreliable, it was widely considered a strategic liability. Alongside the Chieftain sat the Challenger 1, a vehicle that only existed in British service because the Shah of Iran was overthrown before he could take delivery of his custom-ordered fleet of Shir 2 tanks. The Challenger 1 had been rushed into British service as a desperate stopgap, boasting revolutionary composite armor, but suffering from a hastily integrated fire control system that routinely failed during international gunnery competitions. The situation was so dire that the British government seriously considered abandoning domestic tank production altogether to purchase the American M1 Abrams or the German Leopard 2. The Challenger 2 was therefore born under the shadow of the executioner's axe, designed primarily to save Vickers defense systems and preserve Britain's sovereign tank-building capability. This political and economic desperation forged a machine of profound contradictions. The engineers at Vickers were given a mandate to build a world-beating tank on a shoestring budget, forcing them to reuse the basic hull dimensions and automotive footprint of the Challenger 1, while designing an entirely new turret and electronic architecture from scratch. They had to create a vehicle capable of surviving a first-strike environment in the Fulda Gap, where British doctrine dictated fighting from static, hull-down defensive positions to blunt the overwhelming numerical superiority of Soviet armored spearheads. This doctrinal requirement heavily influenced every subsequent engineering decision, producing a tank that prioritized extreme survivability and first-round accuracy over strategic mobility, rapid acceleration, or logistical ease. The designers achieved this by pushing the physical limits of materials science and human endurance, crafting a machine that was virtually impenetrable from the front arc, but weighed nearly 63 tons in its base configuration. When you examine the development of this vehicle, you are not looking at a seamless progression of technological triumph, but rather a brutal series of compromises dictated by a treasury that was reluctant to spend and a military establishment terrified of losing its industrial base. If detailed technical breakdowns of military history and British combat engineering interest you, subscribe. I have got more of these coming. To understand why the Challenger 2 looks and performs the way it does, one must first examine the specialized armor that defines its visual silhouette and dictates its tactical employment on the battlefield. The tank is visually defined by a distinctly slab-sided brutalist aesthetic, characterized by heavily angled facets that completely eschew the rounded cast steel curves of earlier Cold War designs. This boxy, towering profile is a direct consequence of its most highly classified component, the second generation of Chobham armor, officially designated as Dorchester. Unlike traditional rolled homogeneous armor, which relies purely on the thickness and hardness of steel plate to resist penetration, Dorchester is a highly complex composite matrix. While the exact chemical composition and arrangement remain a closely guarded state secret, the fundamental physics of the system are widely understood to comprise alternating layers of high-hardness steel, elastomeric materials, and advanced ceramics housed within rigid titanium or heavy steel cassettes. This armor is not designed to simply deflect incoming fire. It is designed to actively interact with and destroy the incoming munition before it can reach the crew compartment. When a shape-charged warhead, such as a high-explosive anti-tank round from an infantry rocket-propelled grenade, strikes this composite matrix, the materials interact violently and dynamically. A shaped charge relies on creating a hypervelocity jet of superplastic metal to burn and punch its way through steel. As this plasma-like jet penetrates the Dorchester cassettes, the ceramic tiles violently shatter, absorbing the intense thermal energy and kinetic shock. Simultaneously, The elastomeric rubber-like layers rapidly expand under the sudden pressure, essentially feeding raw material directly into the path of the jet to disrupt, destabilize, and degrade its penetrating power. Against kinetic energy penetrators, which are dense darts of depleted uranium or tungsten fired at hypersonic speeds by enemy tanks, the defense mechanism shifts entirely. The varying densities of the steel and ceramic layers induce massive yaw and shear stress on the long, thin metal dart. As the dart attempts to push through the alternating hard and soft layers, the asymmetrical resistance essentially snaps the penetrator in half or severely blunts its tip, rendering it harmless long before it can breach the fighting compartment. However, the integration of this unparalleled protection introduced the first major nested loop of engineering compromises for the Ministry of Defense. Dorchester armor is phenomenally effective, but it is also exceptionally dense and incredibly heavy. The British Army's uncompromising insistence on maximizing crew survivability meant that the frontal arc of the Challenger 2, including the massive flat turret face and the sharply angled glacis plate, was layered incredibly thick with this composite matrix. This design philosophy created a highly protected forward aspect, but drove the overall weight of the vehicle to extremes that fundamentally altered its tactical mobility. At over 63 tons in its standard peacetime configuration, and pushing 75 tons when fitted with additional urban combat armor packages, like the Megatron suite, the tank places immense, punishing stress on its tracks, road wheels, and transmission. Bridges that could easily support a 45-ton Russian T-72 or an older generation of British tank suddenly became impassable obstacles, requiring specialized combat engineering support and bridge-laying equipment just to move the vehicle across the theater of operations. This immense mass also dictates a significantly lower power-to-weight ratio compared to its international peers, meaning the Challenger 2 accelerates far more sluggishly than the gas turbine-powered American M1 Abrams or the highly agile German Leopard 2. British armored doctrine of the late Cold War accepted this mobility penalty without hesitation, reasoning that a tank fighting a desperate defensive battle in Western Europe would not need to sprint like a cavalry horse across open plains. According to the strategists in Whitehall, it merely needed to reach a pre-surveyed firing ramp, absorb massive amounts of incoming fire, and systematically destroy Soviet targets at extreme ranges. This doctrinal belief that survivability trumped mobility would eventually cause significant logistical headaches when the tank was deployed to fast-moving offensive operations in desert environments decades later. But for the engineers of the 1990s, weight was deemed an acceptable price for invulnerability. The defensive doctrine that justified the heavy armor also directly influenced the selection of the main armament, creating a massive divergence from standard NATO logistics that continues to isolate British tank crews to this day. While the rest of the Western Alliance universally adopted the highly successful 120mm Rheinmetall smoothbore gun, the British military stubbornly insisted on installing the domestically produced L-30A1 120mm rifled gun. This decision was not rooted in blind traditionalism or a simple refusal to buy German engineering, but rather in a very specific tactical requirement centered around the continued employment of high-explosive squash-head ammunition. High-explosive squash-head, universally known as HESH, is a uniquely British concept designed to defeat thick steel armor and fortified concrete bunkers without actually piercing them. When the round strikes a hardened target, the thin metal shell deliberately collapses, spreading a flattened disc of plastic explosive across the exterior of the enemy armor before a delayed base fuse detonates it. The resulting explosion does not punch a hole. Instead, it sends a massive, high-frequency shockwave traveling through the steel plate. This shockwave causes the interior wall of the armor to fracture, blowing off a massive high-velocity scab of metal that ricochets around the crew compartment with devastating, lethal effect. Furthermore, HESH rounds are exceptionally effective at demolishing concrete bunkers, leveling brick buildings, and destroying light armored vehicles, providing the tank with a highly versatile multi-purpose tool for general battlefield demolition. Rifling the barrel was absolutely essential for this specific type of ammunition. A HESH round requires the gyroscopic spin imparted by the spiraled rifling grooves to stabilize its flight, ensuring that the warhead flies true, and that the explosive filler strikes the target completely flat for maximum shockwave transmission. But retaining a rifled gun in a world rapidly transitioning to smoothbore technology exacted a tremendous toll on both the future development potential of the tank and the physical well-being of its crew. The physics of armor penetration were rapidly evolving during the 1990s. The most effective way to destroy modern, multi-layered composite armor is with an armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot round. Effectively, a massive metallic dart traveling at over 3,000 miles per hour. A smoothbore gun can fire these finned darts at significantly higher velocities and under much greater chamber pressures than a rifled gun. This is because the rifling grooves in the British gun create massive friction and allow vital propellant gases to bleed out around the driving bands of the projectile, robbing the dart of crucial kinetic energy. Furthermore, spinning a fin-stabilized dart actually degrades its armor penetration capabilities, forcing British engineers to design complex slipping driving bands that attempt to minimize the spin imparted by the rifling. To match the penetrative power of foreign smoothbores, the engineers had to develop specialized, incredibly dense depleted uranium darts, known as the L-27A1 Charm 3 round, pushing the aging rifled gun to its absolute maximum operational pressure limit. Even more problematic than the physics of the barrel was the physical nature of the ammunition itself inside the fighting compartment. Because of the extreme length of the depleted uranium penetrator darts and the specific mechanical requirements of the rifled breech, the ammunition could not be stored as a single unified metallic cartridge like standard rifle bullets. Instead, the Challenger 2 requires a bizarre three-part loading process consisting of the actual projectile, a highly combustible cloth bag or rigid casing of propellant charge, and a completely separate vent tube primer. This three-piece ammunition system created an absolute ergonomic nightmare inside the claustrophobic metal confines of the turret. In a modern American M1 Abrams or a German Leopard 2, the loader merely grabs a single, fully assembled round from the blast-shielded ammunition bustle in the rear of the turret, shoves it cleanly into the breech, and arms the gun in one fluid motion. Inside the Challenger 2, the human loader must perform a highly choreographed, physically exhausting mechanical dance within a cramped, dimly lit steel box filled with exposed hydraulic lines, radio equipment, and jagged metal edges. First, the loader must extract the heavy projectile from a specialized storage bin situated low in the hull, hauling it upward and ramming it forcefully into the breech block. Next, they must pivot, reach into a heavily armored, liquid-filled storage bin designed to prevent catastrophic explosions, extract a highly combustible propellant charge, and ram that into the breech behind the projectile. Finally, they must extract a tiny explosive vent tube from a dispenser and insert it into the firing mechanism to initiate the firing sequence. Doing this while the tank is stationary on a pristine firing range is a difficult, sweaty task. Doing this while the massive vehicle is pitching and rolling violently across uneven terrain at 30 miles per hour requires immense physical strength, spatial awareness, and endless stamina. The turret layout is famously unforgiving, with loader crews frequently suffering bruised ribs, trapped fingers, and severe lower back strain over long deployments. Furthermore, the lack of an isolated blowout ammunition bustle in the rear of the turret, a crucial safety feature that is completely standard on the American M1 Abrams, means that the highly volatile propellant charges are stored directly inside the fighting compartment below the turret ring. While the British smartly utilize armored liquid-filled bins to drastically minimize the risk of a catastrophic ammunition fire, the fundamental truth remains that the crew is surrounded by highly combustible explosives while operating in a combat zone. Knowing what you now know about its real-world survivability and reliability, would you still want to be stationed in this machine during combat? Share your thoughts below. To move this 63-ton metal fortress across the chaotic battlefield, the British Ministry of Defense selected the Perkins Condor Vive 12 turbocharged diesel engine, capable of producing roughly 1,200 shaft horsepower. From a pure engineering perspective, the choice of a traditional diesel engine over a modern gas turbine was a calculated, deliberate trade-off that favored logistical endurance and fuel efficiency over raw acceleration and sprint speed. The American M1 Abrams utilizes a complex aerospace-derived gas turbine that provides phenomenal, almost sports car-like acceleration and a completely smooth ride. but it consumes highly refined aviation fuel at a truly staggering rate, creating an enormous logistical footprint that requires a constant stream of vulnerable fuel trucks. The Perkins diesel engine in the Challenger 2, mated to a reliable David Brown automatic transmission, is far more fuel efficient, granting the heavy tank an operational range of roughly 280 miles on its internal fuel tanks alone. This extended range significantly reduces the burden on the logistical supply chain and allows the British armored squadrons to operate independently for longer durations behind enemy lines. Furthermore, standard diesel fuel is significantly less volatile than aviation fuel or petrol, adding an implicit, highly practical layer of secondary survivability for the crew in the event that the external fuel cells are compromised by incoming shrapnel or a roadside improvised explosive device. However, the Perkins A512 engine is certainly not without its significant drawbacks, particularly when the tank is forced to operate in harsh environments for which it was never originally designed. While 1,200 shaft horsepower sounds incredibly impressive on a specification sheet, it is widely considered by armor officers to be barely adequate for a vehicle of this immense, crushing weight. The engine aggressively struggles on steep inclines, deep sand, and soft, muddy terrain, requiring the driver to constantly and skillfully manage the throttle and gears to prevent the heavy machine from bogging down completely. This inherent lack of raw power was partially mitigated by the inclusion of a brilliant, highly advanced hydrogas suspension system. Unlike the traditional, rigid torsion bar suspensions found on Soviet tanks, like the T-72, which brutally transfer every violently jarring bump and crater directly into the hull of the tank, the hydrogas system uses compressed nitrogen gas and hydraulic fluid to act as both a massive spring and a heavy-duty shock absorber for each individual road wheel. This complex suspension allows the heavy steel tracks to articulate incredibly smoothly over boulders, deep trenches, and the crushed ruins of destroyed vehicles, providing an exceptionally stable ride for the crew inside. This stability is not just about reducing crew fatigue and preventing motion sickness. It is a vital, integrated component of the digital fire control system. Because the heavy hull glides relatively smoothly over rough terrain, the computerized stabilization motors attached to the turret do not have to work nearly as hard to keep the massive main gun locked onto a target. This allows the Challenger 2 to accurately track, engage, and destroy enemy armor while moving at high speeds across the battlefield, achieving a first-round hit probability that was virtually unmatched in the early 2000s. The true test of all these theoretical engineering compromises occurred not on the muddy frozen plains of Germany as originally intended, but in the searing heat and highly abrasive dust of the Middle East during Operation Telek, the massive British contribution to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. When the tank crossed the border, the pristine specifications drawn up in Whitehall collided violently with the harsh operational reality of desert warfare. The vehicle was deployed into an environment that was fundamentally hostile to heavy, complex machinery. The fine, talcum-like sand of the Iraqi desert immediately wreaked absolute havoc on the air filtration systems of the Perkins diesel engine. Mechanics and tank crews found themselves working exhausting, grueling hours in sweltering conditions just to clear the filters and keep the engines from literally choking to death on the abrasive dust. The tracks, bearing the immense weight of the heavily up-armored vehicles, suffered from rapid mechanical wear and required constant, back-breaking tensioning and the manual replacement of heavy steel links in the middle of combat zones. Logistical supply units aggressively struggled to keep up with the soaring demand for specialized spare parts, forcing maintenance crews to actively cannibalize disabled or broken-down tanks just to keep the frontline armored squadrons operational. The reality of maintaining the Challenger 2 in the field was a dirty, exhausting endeavor that quickly stripped away any romantic illusions about the clean, high-tech nature of modern armored warfare. Yet, despite the immense logistical burden, the severe environmental wear, and the constant mechanical struggles, the actual combat performance of the Challenger 2 during the violent drive to Basra completely solidified its legendary, almost mythical reputation for survivability. Iraqi armored forces, largely equipped with aging, poorly maintained Soviet-era T-55 and T-72 tanks, found themselves completely outmatched by the advanced thermal imaging sights and the devastating kinetic energy darts of the British heavy armor. The incredibly thick frontal Dorchester armor proved entirely impervious to the outdated anti-tank munitions fired by the desperate Iraqi defenders. In one widely documented and heavily analyzed engagement, a single Challenger 2 became deeply bogged down in a ditch during a chaotic urban skirmish and was subsequently swarmed by heavily armed insurgent forces. The immobilized, trapped tank absorbed an estimated 70 direct hits from rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine gun fire, and anti-tank missiles, without suffering a single lethal penetration of the internal crew compartment. The disciplined crew simply buttoned up the hatches, utilized their armored optical sights to systematically return fire with the coaxial machine gun, and calmly waited for an armored recovery vehicle to pull them out of the kill zone. Once safely recovered, the battered tank required only superficial, external repairs to its shattered optics and damaged radio fittings before casually returning to active operational duty the very following day. This astonishing, unprecedented level of physical protection provided an immeasurable psychological boost to the tank crews, who rapidly realized that as long as they remained inside the heavily armored citadel of the vehicle, they were virtually untouchable by conventional insurgent weaponry. Tragically, the only weapon system that proved completely capable of definitively destroying a Challenger 2 during that entire brutal conflict was another Challenger 2. In a chaotic, highly confusing night engagement near the city of Basra, a tragic misidentification through degraded thermal sights led to a catastrophic friendly fire incident, colloquially known in military circles as a blue-on-blue engagement. A high-explosive squash head round, fired by a trailing British tank, struck the open commander's hatch of the leading vehicle, directing the explosive blast inward and instantly igniting the exposed combustible propellant charges stored in the fighting compartment. The resulting massive explosion completely destroyed the tank, violently blowing the heavy turret off the hull and killing 2 crew members. This horrific event served as a grim, sobering reminder that no amount of advanced composite armor can fully mitigate the chaos, human error, and friction of war. This tragedy also sharply highlighted the inherent, unavoidable danger of storing explosive propellant charges within the crew compartment, tragically validating the severe criticisms of the ammunition storage layout that had been raised years earlier by defense analysts comparing the British design to the safely compartmentalized layout of the American M1 Abrams. When we evaluate the ultimate historical legacy of the Challenger 2, we must force ourselves to look past the patriotic hyperbole, the impressive combat statistics, and the imposing visual silhouette to see the machine for what it truly is. A highly specialized, deeply flawed tool born from a very specific set of historical and economic circumstances. It was the absolute final expression of a uniquely British philosophy of armored warfare that prioritized thick, impenetrable armor, deliberate defensive tactics, and the logistical simplicity of a diesel engine over strategic mobility, automotive reliability, and standardized NATO armament. The tank succeeded brilliantly in protecting its crews against asymmetric threats and outdated Soviet armor in Iraq and subsequent deployments, but it did so while heavily carrying the severe burdens of an underpowered engine, a physically exhausting and dangerous ammunition system, and an increasingly obsolete rifled main gun that isolated Britain from its key allies. The recent, highly publicized decision by the Ministry of Defense to heavily upgrade the remaining fleet into the new Challenger 3 standard, which completely replaces the aging rifled gun with a standardized NATO smoothbore weapon and entirely overhauls the turret electronics, is a tacit, undeniable admission that the extreme compromises made by engineers in the 1990s have finally reached the end of their operational viability. The Challenger 2 will inevitably be remembered by historians and armor enthusiasts as a magnificent, heavily flawed, and terrifyingly resilient fighting machine that somehow managed to successfully bridge the vast tactical gap between the heavy armor doctrine of the late Cold War and the complex, unpredictable urban counterinsurgencies of the early 21st century. If you found this analysis useful, a like helps more people discover these deep dives. Thanks for watching.